I'm Yann Martel, the author of Life of Pi, The High Mountains of Portugal, and Self, and I'm delighted to be a judge for the next big story from the Novelry. How important is the main character or person in a novel? Well, stories are always ultimately about people, even stories that may be really invested in a landscape or historical event or something. Ultimately, it comes down to people. The main character is called that for a reason. Everything is seen through the eyes of that character or has impact on that character. Usually a story does start with something happening to someone. In my fiction, usually my character is relatively anonymous and sympathetic, so you can sort of slip in beside them. Sort of like someone's driving a car and you slip in beside them and you trust them to drive you the way and you look out and see what they see. So for example, in Life of Pi, Pi is a fairly nice character that you're presumably happy to spend time with. But that's not the only kind of main character you can have that you can root for. You can have deliciously evil characters and you enjoy their evil. Think all the number of Roald Dahl stories with mean parents or horrible children, and you sort of enjoy, because they're not truly horrible. There's something amusing or alluring about them that draws you along. So it's not about necessarily main characters being likable, but you somehow have to be invested in them. There has to be something about them for which you want to see an outcome. Not necessarily a happy ending. For example, how many crime stories are set up where you know who's done the murder and you're kind of curious to how they will be found out. So you love hating them. You just have to make the character alluring in some way, whether they're good or bad. Just something about them where you're curious about the outcome, how they will end up. I don't normally, when I'm thinking of a story, think of character first. It's more of an event, a circumstance, and out of that a character will emerge. These other peripheral thematic things that eventually brought me to the character. Pi Patel in Life of Pi emerged as a character in a fairly secondary way, in the sense that I was more interested in this idea of someone in a shipwreck with an animal. I was more interested in the metaphor of the lifeboat being a metaphor in the human condition. We are a mixture of the divine and the animal. The crossing of the Pacific is like the crossing of a human life. The reaching of the coast of Mexico is sort of like the reaching of salvation. I was more interested in those, and in that, Pi's specific character was kind of secondary. So in fact, I would say Life of Pi is not a character-driven story. It's more of a fable, it's more of an allegory, it's more driven by the thematic interests of it. But for other people, it'll be very different, of course. Character will be the central thing, and everything will follow from that. Another novel I wrote called Self, where the main character, while backpacking in Portugal, switches from being boy to a woman at 18. That one was more character driven because it was essentially a story of a single person and their changing identity. So that one was more character driven, and that was done earlier. And that, once again, though, it emerges from the ideas you're trying to discuss. Because after all, also in life, character is fluid. I mean, some people we think of as being very fixed, but most of us are fairly fluid. Depending on our circumstances, our age, we will change, evolve. So characters in a novel do the same thing. As I said, for me, it kind of depends on the story, what the character will be. By the third page, you certainly want to know what the story is about and who it will revolve around, which is not to say that all the characters have to be introduced. In fact, if you're writing an epic about 3 generations of Irish family, you're obviously not going to meet all the characters because some maybe aren't even born. But certainly the catalyst, one of the main catalysts, should be met fairly early on. In terms of problem, does every story need to revolve around some sort of problem? Well, yes. You can have an 800-page novel in which absolutely nothing happens because your voice is so amazing and your style is so amazing, but that's a rare feat to achieve and not necessarily one you want to do every second day. So usually a story will revolve around some issue. So Moby Dick revolves around this big white whale that Captain Ahab is obsessed about. The Outsider by Camus starts with the death of the character's mother. Usually a story is revolve around some issue that is the catalyst for further action to which there's eventually some kind of outcome. A classic one would be genre fiction. A murder mystery usually ends with the resolution of who did it. You don't all have to have that. There are some clever ones where you never find out, but usually, there's a murder and you find out who done it. A romance, usually, the boy gets the girl gets the boy, the girl gets the girl, the boy gets the boy. Usually there's some sort of romantic denouement that is possibly satisfying. But there has to be a problem to start with. There has to be a challenge, something that needs accomplishing. And the story is all about that, how it's resolved. Whether successfully or not, happily or not, that's not the issue. But there has to be some sort of mountain to climb. The problem in a story doesn't have to be life and death. Little Red Riding Hood, she just has to deliver a basket of food to her grandmother. It's a completely trivial, mundane task, but rich in adventure nonetheless. There are wolves out there, and it's also highly symbolic. So it's not a question of high action, high stake necessarily. It's just how it resonates with the reader. It has to speak to the reader somehow. So it's not always a question of frenetic action and multiple murders and explosions. That, in fact, gets quite tiresome. How many James Bond movies can you watch in a row without, I've had enough here? Same thing with any kind of story. You want variety, including the quieter ones, which revolve around emotional subtleties. But nonetheless, those have to be announced relatively early on. It'd be surprising to read a novel that goes on for 150 pages in a very subtle mode and suddenly have explosions and mass murder and zombies. Usually it's announced fairly quickly, but it doesn't have to be major stakes. There just has to be a stake of some sort. The kinds of problems that a story might be about range from, boy meets girl, boy wants girl, but girl is inaccessible, Romeo and Juliet. It could be financial, Grapes of Wrath, family's very poor, they have to move. They have to seek their fortune somewhere else. So an immigration kind of story where you move. Life of Pi, in a sense, is like that. It could be, a more plot-driven one would be like an action one where there's an evil conspiracy to take over the world and Agent James Bond 007 needs to somehow beat the bad guys. There's coming-of-age stories. You're immature, you make mistakes, you grow from them. There's so many possible premises and solutions. That's what's wonderful about stories is they are literally infinite. There are more stories than there are people on this planet. Some stories are very definitely set in place with a capital P. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon is all about Scotland. It's really set in Scotland. It's all about Scottish accents, kilts. It's Scottish through and through. Place is exceedingly important in that story. But if you think of something like Waiting for Godot, in Waiting for Godot, you basically have one tree. And then you have a bunch of characters talking. In that case, the story is nearly irrelevant. You possibly could even not have the tree, just have a drawing on the wall of a tree. So there it's very much a story that's in a sense in your head. I mentioned Moby Dick earlier. Moby Dick set on a ship. Some seafaring stories, obviously the ship is important. So it kind of varies, but so that's one, in fact, that I would think varies probably the most. Every story needs a person, a character. Every story needs some kind of plot, some kind of story, some kind of problem. Place, it kind of depends on the flavor of the story you want. Some stories are very much set in a place because it's a source of culture, of stories themselves. Like, a story set in India can be really redolent of India, the sights, the smells, the culture. Whereas, as I said, other stories are more just abstractions. Life of Pi starts in India, but most of it takes place on a lifeboat, surrounded by water. So yes, that is a place, but it's a place that could be anywhere. It could be the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. In that sense, in my feeling, the place was important because it was an ocean, so the ocean life was important. But very quickly, you got the place and you moved on to something else. Other stories, as I said, are more rooted in place, and it constantly comes up. So horror stories are usually very located in place. There's a good example. It'd be hard to have a horror story that was set in a very abstract setting. Usually horror stories are rooted to place because that place is a source of tension. So a bunch of teenagers go to a party in a remote house that has been abandoned for decades. They break in, they have fun, and then suddenly one of the teenagers does not come back. So they all want to leave, but somehow mysteriously the doors are locked. And then they start hearing creepy noises. That all comes from place. The house, the haunted house, becomes very important to the story. So there's one case where place very much comes to the fore. Place, just like geography is full of features and topographies, so is place in a story, and that can be a source of events, like literally earthquakes, quicksand. These are things that are located in place, and that can be a source of problems in your story. The main setting of Life of Pi is an ocean, and that plays a role in the sense that it's a restriction on Pi. He cannot escape that ocean. He's stuck on a lifeboat, and he has to survive. So place was important for me. I spent a lot of time doing research on ocean currents, ocean life, ocean weather. I spent a lot of time researching survival at sea. How do you survive in a very inhospitable environment, as you would in a desert or on a high mountain? So that nourished the story because it, in a sense, gave me challenges. How will Pi survive? How will that tiger survive in an ocean? He must find food. He must find potable water. The place gave me problems to resolve, problems for my character to resolve, which helps your story move along. If you have a problem, that usually leads to plot. And the fact the two, I think, are closely related. It'd be funny to have a story with absolutely no problems that yet has a good plot. And at the same time, it'd be funny to have a story that has a huge problem but no plot. Now, plot, I think, is something that you have to think about carefully, because I think some writers, especially emergent writers, perhaps overemphasize plot. Yes, of course, something has to happen in a story. You have to have some kind of story. In fact, sometimes plot and story are sort of somewhat synonymous, but there's a problem with too much plot. And you will see that in any number of Netflix series, let's say, where the production is great and the plot is really appealing, but at the end of it, somehow you forget it. A week later, you've completely forgotten what it was about. And that often happens when a story is too plot driven. You know, a story in which someone can escape a room, then they escape it, and then they can't escape the building, and then they can't escape the city, and then they can't escape the country. You know, if it's just problems and overcoming that problem, obstacle, and they're overcoming constantly, and you can do that very cleverly with all kinds of obstacles, at one point it becomes tiresome. It is nothing but that. Ultimately, in a story, that to me the most satisfying kind of story is one where yes, obviously there has to be some sort of plot, but you also have to have something that feeds your mind. And that's not necessarily plot. A plot will feed your heart. You want your heart to go pitter-patter, to beat a little bit faster in a story. But not just that, because that's like eating candy. It tastes really good, but there's no nourishment to it. Nourishment in a story doesn't necessarily come from plot. It comes from the result of plot. What do you learn? What does the character learn from the plot, from the problem? How do they grow? How do they change? What does it all mean? You want something more memorable. A perfect example, if you want, of a story that perfectly balanced plot with non-plot, with thematic concerns, intellectual concerns, is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. It's a short little novella, 80 pages. One morning, Gregor Samsa wakes up and he's an enormous beetle. He is literally being transformed, metamorphosized into an enormous beetle. So there you see the bit of a plot there. You have a character who changes radically, repels the other characters in the story. There you have your plot. But what's lovely about Metamorphosis is that it's also about it comes down to identity. What does it mean to be you, to be me? What does it mean to be oneself? How do others interpret us? How do we live with each other? The story is about a story. There is a story in there. Things happen, but it's just as much about what does it mean. And to have something mean something, you don't need to have frenetic action. So Metamorphosis is a perfect example of the two being nicely balanced. Yes, there is plot, but not too much. Otherwise, it becomes forgettable. But there's also intellectual concerns, but not too many, because otherwise it gets boring. There's no reason to read a boring story. The plot developed in Life of Pi incrementally, in part as a result of research. That's another thing I do a lot of when I write my books. It's a lovely way of staying at school. I do research. So Life of Pi, I knew very little about animal behavior and zoobiology. I knew little about survival at sea. There are certain religious faith concerns in Life of Pi from a secular perspective. I knew relatively little about Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. All those fed the story, fed the plot. Once I knew more about survival at sea, it gave me certain problems to be overcome, the finding of fresh water, the finding of food, therefore ways the plot could move forward, because Pi has to overcome those. The very thinking of Life of Pi was a story that, in fact, is two stories. The fact that there are parallel stories allowed me, there's a necessity of having a parallel between the two stories. That advanced the plot, too. If something happened in one story, it had to have a sort of echo in the other. They had to sort of symbolically match. So that, in a sense, gave me plot, or the necessity of plot. Every time I learned something new in terms of survival at sea, let's say, or animal behavior, that nourished the plot, because in a sense it elaborated plot. The tiger in Life of Pi. Once I knew more about tiger behavior, that gave me, there's going to be conflict here with Pi. Well, first of all, there's conflict because he's a tiger anyway, but the tiger needs to survive. But the tiger isn't actually quite as helpless. So in a sense, some ways the Pi could help the tiger could help Pi. So there you start having the elements of things that could happen. I think there are kind of two kinds of writers when it comes to the plot. Those who write more spontaneously, so you kind of just start with a premise or a character and you just see where the characters will take you. And then there's other people who more carefully craft where it's going and they plot everything out and they know where they're going. And I'm more like that. There's no one that's better. It just comes naturally to how people write. It definitely depends on what kind of a writer you are, whether you're a planner or a more spontaneous one. But that will also have your plot develop in a different way. If you're more spontaneous, it can take completely unexpected turns, which could either doom your story. It starts as a Western, turns a romance, becomes a spy novel. That's really hard to pull off. If you overplan, then maybe it feels a bit mechanical. It feels a bit dry, a bit stilted, maybe. Spontaneous writers tend to start really well, but then they peter out, so the ending is, unmemorable. People who plot it out more carefully, I find, usually it starts well enough, ends well enough, but maybe the middle lags a little bit because they have to get from beginning to end. They thought about the beginning, they thought about the end, but they failed to really account for something lively in the middle. So each has its advantage, each has its disadvantages. There's always problems to overcome. Written stories are rooted in words. What's wonderful about language is it's an instrument that you don't need to master to use. Everyone can play language, in that it's not like a musical instrument. We have expectations of proficiency with musical instruments. If someone said to you, I'm a singer-songwriter and I play the guitar and I play the piano, and they picked up their guitar or sat at their piano and they started playing one of their songs and they were terrible players, making incessant mistakes, it might initially be kind of interesting. We're not used to this idea of someone claiming to play the piano and playing very poorly, but it might have an initial appeal, but eventually we get tired of the poor playing. There's an expectation of a degree of proficiency with musical instruments. What's interesting about language, it's that it's inherent to who we are. Being able to deliver a story has nothing to do with good grammar and good syntax and having been to Oxford. It all has to do with story and authenticity. So it is definitely the case that you have writers who tell great stories who aren't good spellers, who perhaps aren't even good writers, but they have a sense of story. And there's also now the question, the funny one, of authenticity. Sometimes a story is great, not because of the big words and all that, but just because of the authenticity of the story. So, it's an obvious one, for example, a Holocaust survivor, someone who's overcome a traumatic event with which you are sympathetic. They deliver that story pretty well any which way, and there's something about it that draws you in. So there's something, that intangible thing called authenticity, that sense of life truth that will come through no matter if you're good at your grammar, good at your spelling. Prose isn't about big words, fancy sentences with, 24 subordinate clauses. Prose is about communicating your story, communicating that heartbeat in you that you want to transmit to the other. And language, any language at any level of proficiency can communicate that. A simple example, a baby cries. It's communicating a story. It's communicating want. I want my mommy. I want my daddy. That sound communicates an emotion. That's what stories are about. How charming is it when your little kid who's 5 years old writes a sentence? The spelling is atrocious. It's totally phonetic. The syntax is terrible. It's absolutely adorable. It's, once again, communicating because there's an authenticity there. So prose is not about writing like Proust or like Shakespeare. It is about the heartbeat behind that. Finding your natural writing voice, at least to start with, is usually just your own voice. I'd say everyone has one story to tell at least, which is usually the story of their own lives. So there, the authenticity is just being true to yourself. Any number of immigrant stories, any number of coming-of-age stories, any number of coming out of the closet stories are about relaying what happened to you, how you came to be who you are. So that story, the voice comes from being true to yourself. Then the trick is that second, third, fourth, fifth book, where you're leaving the biographical, the autobiographical behind. There's nothing wrong with the biographical or the autobiographical, but unless you've had an extraordinarily eventful life, you want to get beyond that. Start, first of all, by telling your first story well, and then you'll realize that it's kind of like, to contradict what I said earlier, it is kind of like a musical instrument. Once you sort of know how to strum a story on your guitar, it does get easier to tell a second and a third story. But so start with what's close to home, as they always say, with what you know. And then soon enough, you'll be able to start doing what you don't know, because you're going to start exploring, you're going to start doing research, you're going to start thinking through language and through story. And then it'll start coming. But to start with, I would say stick to the voice that is closest to you. And that means the one that is the most emotionally true to you. Should you use AI to improve your writing style? I'd say no, because all AI is the aggregate of what everyone else has done. So if you use AI, that's the fastest way to write conventionally. It's unlikely that you use AI that it's going to recommend that you string together 7 adjectives in a row, that you have a sentence that's 3 pages long, or a sentence that's only 3 words long and 10 of those in a row. A great art is about breaking the rules, but breaking them intelligently. I suspect AI can't do that. The other thing, too, is why would you want to use AI? The very point of writing, I presume, certainly for me, is enjoying language itself. So why would you want someone else to do it for you? In a sense, AI is just another ghostwriter. I guess you use a ghostwriter if you don't like writing. But if you don't like writing, at one point you shouldn't be a writer. Normally you are a writer because you enjoy writing, including making mistakes. Because those, in fact, at one point, those mistakes are not mistakes. They're just who you are. That's your style. I would recommend don't use AI. It's the very involvement of the muck of language that will ultimately yield something that is truly you. Do I have any tips for writing good, clean prose? Yes. Rewrite it 40 times. Like, for example, I would generally say beware of adverbs. Adverbs, he spoke loudly. She said shyly. Those Lee words signal often too much to the reader. You're starting to tell the reader how to feel, and the reader doesn't like that. The reader wants to discover for himself, for herself, how to feel. So beware of adverbs. Be sparse with the adjectives. Nouns and verbs are pretty good. Punctuation is really cool. It's like the brake and the accelerator in your car. A full stop is like braking. A comma is like accelerating and slowing down. Play with that. And we will all do this as writers. We will say, oh, I'm a genius. I just wrote a sentence that's like 3/4 of a page, and you just love it, and it's central to your story. Then your first reader says, I got lost in it. I couldn't follow it. And then you have to make the decision whether you follow that editorial advice or you ignore it. You may cut that sentence in half. Eventually, you may just delete the sentence, and you're totally embarrassed about it. It's playing in language that will make you more proficient. And it's not about clean necessarily, it's about effective. You want that short or that long sentence to deliver something. And you'll discover how to do it yourself by just experimenting. Trying a short sentence, trying a long sentence, trying big long words, trying obscure words, trying really plain words. It just has to work. So as I said, language is an instrument that anyone can play. You just have to have that sense of a story, of something you want to communicate. And that will communicate itself whether you, as I said, you speak the Queen's English.